On the 9th of May 1940, all along Germany's western borders, the forces of the Wehrmacht were packing up and getting ready to move. Hitler's insistence on secrecy and speed was followed to the letter. Even frontline commanders were not informed of the offensive's launch until the last moment. In the early hours of May the 10th, Luftwaffe crews were roused out of their beds and told to be ready for action within 15 minutes. Before dawn, every available Luftwaffe plane was airborne. Meanwhile, long columns of panzers were leaving their quarters and driving along the approach routes to France and the Low Countries. At first light, the skies over Belgium and Holland were suddenly filled with the roar of Luftwaffe planes. Wave after wave of fighters, bombers, and transports swept over the frontiers. After 8 months of uneasy peace, war had finally come to the West. As he prepared to launch his great offensive, Adolf Hitler left Berlin with his entourage in his personal train. Despite the wariness that some of his generals continued to feel about the coming campaign, he felt supremely confident. He asserted that the French were too fond of easy living and lacked fighting spirit. He declared that by applying all means at its command, Germany could deliver one gigantic knockout blow. The German forces assembled along the Western Front were divided into 3 army groups. In the north was Army Group B, commanded by 55-year-old General Fedor von Bock, a First World War hero who came from a long-established military family. His forces were 18th Army, facing Holland, and 6th Army, facing northern Belgium. Army Group B totaled 29 divisions, 3 of which were armored and 2 motorized. Amongst these formations were 4,500 paratroops and 1 airborne light infantry division. These units would play a key role in the coming offensive. Extending from Liège to Luxembourg was Army Group A, under General Karl von Rundstedt, one of the Wehrmacht's most resourceful and flexible-minded commanders. A general since 1927, Rundstedt was highly respected within the army. His command was made up of 4th Army, 12th Army, and 16th Army. Altogether, Army Group A mustered 35 infantry divisions. Its key units, however, were the 7 armored and 3 motorized divisions which would form the vanguard of the attack. Nearly all of Germany's heavy panzers had been allotted to this massive armored phalanx. In the south, deployed opposite the Maginot Line, was Army Group C, commanded by Colonel General Ritter von Leeb. Having left the army in 1938, he had been recalled from retirement on the outbreak of war. Army Group C's formations were drawn from 7th Army on the east bank of the Rhine and 1st Army in Lorraine. It had a fighting strength of 19 infantry divisions. Added to the ground forces was the formidable striking power of Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe. A prominent World War I flying ace, Göring had risen to be the highest-ranking Nazi after Hitler himself. The Luftwaffe had over 3,000 planes committed to the Western offensive. Army Groups A and B were each supported by a self-contained air fleet, comprising fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. The Stuka dive bombers, which would provide close support artillery for the armor, remained under the centralized control of Goering. The Germans maintained a reserve strength of 42 divisions, of which 2 were motorized. This reserve was under the direct command of the Commander-in-Chief, General Walter von Brauchitsch. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Maurice Gamelin, had his headquarters at the Château de Vincennes on the outskirts of Paris. Gamelin had chosen Vincennes so that he could be close to his political masters, but it was nearly 100 miles from the front. It did not even possess a radio communications center. From this distant ivory tower, Gamelin surveyed the Allied forces poised to meet the German onslaught. On the extreme left, from the North Sea to Bayeux, was the French 7th Army under General Henri Giraud. 60 years old, Giraud was considered one of France's ablest generals. His army consisted of 7 elite divisions, including 2 motorized infantry and 1 light mechanized division. Next in line came the British Expeditionary Force, under Lord John Gort. Though subordinate to Gamelin, Gort had the right of appeal to his own government before carrying out any order which imperiled his force. The British Expeditionary Force's position stretched from Bayeux to Molde. It included 9 infantry divisions and 1 tank brigade, as well as supporting units. From Molde to the western end of the Maginot Line was Army Group 1 under General Biot. Biot would also be given the responsibility of liaising with the Belgian forces. Army Group 1 consisted of 1st Army, 9th Army, and 2nd Army. These formations comprised 21 divisions in all, including 14 infantry, 3 motorized infantry, and 6 light mechanized divisions. Holding the Maginot Line itself was Army Group 2 under General Prételat. Prételat's command numbered 4 armies, totaling some 44 divisions, one of which was British. The French General Reserve consisted of 22 divisions, including all 3 armored divisions and 2 motorized infantry divisions. Of this total, 7 divisions, including 2 armored, were earmarked for Army Group 1. Another 5 infantry divisions were allotted to guard against a possible German strike through Switzerland. The French Air Force's planes were deployed in so-called zones of air operations, corresponding to the boundaries of the different army groups. The French Air Force numbered some 1,200 planes, comprising bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance craft. These were reinforced by 350 planes of the RAF. To the north, the Dutch army mustered 8 divisions with 2 more in reserve, and the Belgian army fielded 18 divisions with an extra 4 in reserve. At sunrise on May the 10th, waves of Luftwaffe bombers struck at roads, railways, and airfields in Holland, Belgium, and France. While the Dutch frontier defenses were being attacked to the east, thousands of German paratroops and airborne troops were dropped over the key cities of Rotterdam and The Hague. These troops took the Dutch defenders completely by surprise and succeeded in capturing and holding the vital bridges on the Rhine until the mobile ground forces could come up. It was the first major attempt in history to conquer a country from the air, and the success of the airborne operation was vital to the whole invasion's outcome. To disguise the small numbers of their airborne troops, the Germans adopted the ruse of dropping dummy parachutists at scores of locations, effectively creating the impression of overwhelming numbers. The trick also helped spread panic and confusion amongst defending forces. The attack against Belgium was also spearheaded by paratroops, whose objectives were the two main bridges over the Albert Canal and the key fortress of Eben Emael. The fortress was the linchpin of Belgium's main line of defense. It dominated the Albert Canal, the main roads leading west, and the vitally important high bridges over the canal. Built between 1932 and 1936, it was regarded as the strongest fort in the world. Measuring 900 yards by 700, its fortifications were a tight complex of mutually supporting artillery and infantry installations. A series of forts with observation posts, searchlights and machine guns was linked together by a network of tunnels. The only access to the network was through Fort 17. There were turrets with twin revolving cannon, retractable cannon, and rapid fire guns. There were also anti-aircraft machine guns and dummy positions. On its northeastern side, a steep slope plunged 40 meters to the Albert Canal, providing complete security. On its northwestern side, the floodplain of the River Jäger had been raised by the fortifications. Extra security was provided by a steeply embanked trench containing machine guns, anti-tank cannon, and searchlights. Similarly equipped trenches faced west and south, and here there were also 4-meter-high walls. The Allies counted on Eben Emael holding out for at least 5 days, which would give their troops time to get in position on the Deal line. The mission of capturing Eben Emael was entrusted to a tiny but highly trained unit of 78 parachute engineers. The key element in the attack was the use of gliders, which transported the troops to their target in absolute silence. Attack from the air was the one thing Eben Emael was not protected against. When the gliders crash-landed onto its roof in the dawn half-light of May the 10th, the defenders were taken completely by surprise. In the first 10 minutes, the Germans occupied 9 installations. They then blew up the casemates and cupolas of all the guns with a new, high-intensity hollow charge explosive. Finally, they kept the fort's garrison of 1,200 men pinned down until the arrival, 24 hours later, of the advanced troops from 6th Army. The capture of Eben Emael was achieved with the loss of only 6 German dead and 15 wounded. It was a sensational coup. Afterwards, Hitler would decorate personally all the engineers who had taken part in the operation. About an hour and a half after the opening of the German offensive in the north, the French commander, General Gamenin, ordered the implementation of the Deal plan. The units of the Allied First Army Group rolled across the Belgian border and advanced towards their allotted positions along the River Deal. Here they planned to halt the advancing Germans. Gamenin felt calm and confident, delighted that the Germans were attacking just where he had guessed they would. On the Allied left, the French 7th Army raced northwards to link up with the Dutch as part of Gamelin's so-called Breda variant. By lunchtime the following day, they reached Tilburg, only to find their advance cut off by the 9th Panzer Division. The Dutch had already been forced to retreat northwards. Gamelin's Breda variant was thus negated at a stroke, and Giraud had no option but to fall back towards Antwerp. Along the River Deel itself, other Allied units were horrified to find that the defences were incomplete. Worst of all, the quick collapse of Épernay-Mael had already forced the Belgians to start falling back toward the Deel, well before many of the Allied units had even got into position. As battle was being joined in the Low Countries, to the south, Army Group A's massive armoured formations were moving forward towards the Ardennes. These were arrayed in 3 densely packed blocks, with armoured divisions in the first 2 and motorised infantry in the third. Altogether, their columns stretched out for 100 miles. Overhead, an immense umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters flew cover against any possible air attack by the Allies. But with Allied eyes fixed firmly on Belgium, no such attack came. Within 2 days, the mechanized spearheads of Army Group A erupted out of the Ardennes. Surging across the French border, they arrived at the banks of the River Meuse on the afternoon of May the 12th. The German forces in this sector comprised 3 panzer divisions and the elite Großdeutschland motorized infantry regiment. For their imminent attempt to cross the river, they were promised overwhelming air support. Facing them were 10 infantry divisions drawn from the French 9th and 2nd Armies. These were woefully short of anti-tank and anti-aircraft artillery, and 6 of the divisions consisted of reservists, many of whom were over 40 years old. The successful crossing of the Meuse was vital for the German invasion. Only then would the panzers be able to fan out and operate on favorable ground. When the Germans launched their assault, the main effort was made just west of Sedan. On the afternoon of the 13th, 12 squadrons of Stukas struck and forced the French gunners on the far side of the river to retreat into their dugouts. At 4 p.m., detachments of panzer infantry in rubber boats began crossing the river. These units managed to secure a toehold on the opposite bank. By midnight, the Germans had driven a wedge 5 miles deep in the French defences and built another bridge across which the panzers began to pour. On the 14th of May, Allied airstrikes were mounted against the German bridgeheads, but as in Belgium, ground flak units beat them off, inflicting heavy casualties. Indeed, in this engagement, the RAF incurred the greatest rate of loss it ever sustained in any single operation, losing 40 out of 71 planes. By that afternoon, all 3 panzer divisions, 1st, 2nd and 10th, were across the river and had repulsed a French counterattack. Commanding them was General Heinz Guderian. Aged 52, Guderian was a pioneer of blitzkrieg tactics and its most outstanding exponent. Although the German High Command mistrusted Guderian's revolutionary theories, Hitler found them attractive and had sanctioned the earlier formation of panzer divisions. In command of an armored corps for the invasion of Poland, Guderian had played a key role in the German victory. His tanks achieved deep penetration with such incredible speed, they earned their commander the nickname Hurrying Heinz. Despite his success, the High Command continued to feel uneasy about Guderian's methods of striking into enemy terrain far ahead of infantry support. Consequently, when arrangements were being finalized for the Western offensive, they made his command subordinate to the more conservatively minded General Paul Ludwig von Kleist. With his tanks safely across the Meuse, a number of options were open to Guderian. He could wait for the infantry, who were still 36 hours away from Sedan, to catch up. He could push on towards Paris, or swing round to take the Maginot defenses from the rear. However, Guderian ordered 1st and 2nd Panzer to change direction and drive west toward the Ardennes Canal with the objective of breaking clear through the French defenses. The Ardennes Canal formed the hinge between the French 2nd and 9th Armies, and if Guderian could breach that line, he would split apart the Allied armies and strike at the flank and rear of the forces moving into Belgium. The main danger was that the swing west would leave his left flank exposed, and he left the 10th Panzer and the Grossdeutschland Regiment to guard against any Allied counterstrike. Reacting to the German breakthrough at Sedan, the French ordered the crack 3rd Armoured Division to attack the Sedan bridgehead on the morning of the 14th. However, it failed to reach its start lines until late that afternoon, and also found itself without artillery or infantry support. The local commander, 2nd Army's General Hunziker, called off the attack and ordered the division's tanks to be dispersed amongst his infantry units, thus dismantling the one Allied force which stood a chance of repelling the panzers. Hunziker also decided to pull back his left flank to guard against a German thrust into eastern France. This merely widened the Sedan breach from 5 miles to 15. Further up the River Meuse, German panzers had also crossed at Monthermé and Dinant and severely battered the units of General Korap's 9th Army. The Dinant crossing had been made by 7th Panzer under the command of a 48-year-old Major General Erwin Rommel. By the evening of the 15th, Guderian's panzers had broken through the defenses on the Ardennes Canal, and the roads to the west lay open. Yet that very evening, Kleist, worried that Guderian's forces were overextended, ordered him to halt and confine his troops to the bridgehead already gained. Guderian argued forcefully against the order and received permission to continue the advance for another 24 hours in order to widen the bridgehead. With his customary boldness, Guderian made the most of this permission, advancing 50 miles as far as the River Oise. To his right, Rommel also advanced some 50 miles, capturing 10,000 prisoners and 100 tanks for the loss of only 35 killed and 59 wounded. At nightfall on the 16th, Guderian was again ordered to halt. Neither Hitler nor his high command could quite believe how easily the French had been overcome. They were still fearful of a strong counterattack against the vulnerable left flank, and Hitler insisted on Guderian waiting until an infantry corps could come up and form a flank shield. as Guderian's panzers were slicing through French defences to the south, in the north, the Germans were also gaining the upper hand. On May the 12th and 13th, the first major tank battle of the war took place. At Merdo, the French First Army's two light mechanized divisions came into contact with powerful elements of the German 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions, ably supported by Stuka dive bombers. On the first day, the French tanks did well, proving that on a one-to-one basis they could match the much-vaunted panzers. The Samuas, in particular, could stand more than one hit by all but the heaviest German tank cannon. However, as the battle progressed, the panzers' superior tactics enabled them to outmaneuver the French repeatedly, and at nightfall on the 13th, the French tanks withdrew. That same evening, the tanks of the 9th Panzer Division reached the outskirts of Rotterdam, and the Dutch position, despite heroic resistance, became hopeless. The next day, following ferocious Luftwaffe bombing raids on Rotterdam, Holland capitulated. The German breakthrough on the Meuse reduced Gamelin's entire strategy to tatters. Realizing the extent of the catastrophe, French Premier Paul Reynaud phoned Winston Churchill early on the 15th to say, "We have lost the battle." Churchill insisted that the advancing panzers would have to stop soon to resupply, at which stage they could be attacked and cut off. The sheer speed of the German advance had thrown Gamelin and his commanders completely off balance. In trying to devise effective counterstrokes, they kept thinking in terms of infantry pace rather than panzer pace, and so were consistently too slow in responding to the changing situation. Time and again, they would designate a halt line where the German advance could be stemmed, only to find that the panzers had already passed that line. Early on the 15th, General Giraud was switched from the 7th Army to take over the shattered remnants of the 9th Army. Late that night, Gamelin, realizing the breach at Sedan was irreparable, ordered the whole Allied front in Belgium to be withdrawn to the line of the River Scheldt. Poor liaison meant that the BEF and the Belgians did not receive the order until the following day. On May the 16th, Paul Reynaud took steps to replace Gamelin and summoned General Maxime Weygand from Syria to assume command. Weygand was 73 years old and had been recalled from retirement just the previous year. He didn't reach France until May the 19th, causing a further delay in Allied attempts to devise effective countermeasures. In any case, Weygand's ideas were just as outdated as Gamelin's, and so his accession to the command saw no significant change in Allied tactics. Following the French collapse at Sedan, the British War Cabinet decided that they would send no more RAF fighters across the Channel. On May the 17th, the Royal Navy were informally asked to draw up plans for the possible evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from France. In south, on May the 17th, a counterattack was launched against the Panzer Corridor by Colonel de Gaulle's 4th Armoured Brigade, but this was easily repulsed. On May the 18th, Guderian reached Peronne, while to the north, Rommel occupied Cambrai. That same night, General Giraud arrived at his new headquarters to find that the 41st Panzer Corps had got there before him. Early the following morning, he was captured by a German tank patrol. Later that day, de Gaulle's 4th Armoured Brigade mounted another attack against Guderian's flank, but the panzers, well supported by Stukas, again beat him off. To the north, on May the 17th, Louvain and Brussels were occupied by the German 6th Army. As the Allied troops retreated westwards through Belgium, they began to threaten the right flank of the German advance. In the early hours of May the 20th, Rommel occupied the strategic heights near Arras. He was about to be attacked by the British Expeditionary Force. The offensive, launched on May the 21st, was supposed to be made by 2 British and 8 French divisions. However, the French were still not ready at the allotted time, and so the British had to attack on their own. With only 3 infantry battalions and 74 tanks. Nevertheless, they took Rommel's forward units completely by surprise and succeeded in driving them back 10 miles, destroying a large number of panzers. The German artillery could make little impression on the heavily armoured Matildas, and in desperation, Rommel formed a gun line made up largely of flak 88s. Firing over open sights, the German guns finally stemmed the British advance. One 88 battery alone knocked out 9 British tanks. Heavy attacks by Stukas later that evening forced the British to withdraw. As the British Expeditionary Force were preparing to attack at Arras, General Weygand was startled to learn that Guderian's panzers had reached the Channel coast the previous evening. The Allied armies in the north were now completely cut off. After much debate, it was decided the Allies would fall back to a new front marked by Valenciennes, the River Escaut, the old frontier position from Molde to Allouin, and the River Lys. A strong offensive was also planned, involving a simultaneous strike from both north and south. While returning to his headquarters, General Biot was killed in a car crash, and it was not until the following day that his successor received the necessary orders. The French First Army was consequently behind schedule. As the Allies effected the withdrawal to their new positions, their progress was severely hampered by the flood of refugees fleeing the advancing Germans and continuous Luftwaffe bombing raids. On May the 22nd, Brauchitsch ordered Army Group A to swing right. It was to head for a line through Armentières, Ypres and Ostend, cutting off the Channel ports as they advanced. Army Group B was to wheel its left flank around to face north, thus strengthening the walls of the trap. That same day, 2nd Panzer reached Boulogne, and on May the 23rd, 10th Panzer invested Calais. While fighting continued to rage around both ports, by May the 24th, 1st Panzer Division had reached the line of the Aar Canal, barely 10 miles from Dunkirk. At this moment, the Germans were closer to Dunkirk than most British formations, and between them and their objective, there stood just one British Expeditionary Force Battalion. Total victory was within the Germans' grasp. Yet as they stood poised to deliver the coup de grace, they were stunned to receive orders to halt. The order to halt, Hitler not only approved his decision to halt the armor, he also gave orders that the halt be made permanent. As the panzers were driving ever deeper into France, Hitler had become increasingly edgy and nervous. He feared that at any moment an Allied counterstroke could cut them off and deny him his imminent victory. Frightened by his own success, he preferred to pull the reins on his advancing columns rather than take any risks. Hitler may even have wanted to avoid destroying the BEF. While visiting Rundstedt, Hitler astonished his generals by speaking admiringly of the British Empire. He claimed all he wanted from Britain was that she acknowledge Germany's continental supremacy. Once France was defeated, Hitler assumed he could make peace with Britain. Sparing the British army would, Hitler believed, make that peace easier to reach. Above all, there was the influence of Hermann Goering. Goering was eager that the glory of the final victory should belong to the Luftwaffe. He argued that the Luftwaffe was much more loyal to the Nazi Party than the army, and they therefore deserved the honor of the ultimate triumph. The Luftwaffe commander assured Hitler that his air force could finish off Dunkirk on its own. Goering's arguments gave Hitler the final justification he was looking for to halt the panzers. Since May the 20th, a huge flotilla of ships of all sizes was being assembled along England's Channel coast in case the British Expeditionary Force would have to be evacuated. These would later be augmented by thousands of small boats, essential for ferrying troops from shore to ship. Many of the small boats, which included yachts, lifeboats, trawlers and more, were manned by civilian volunteers. The planned evacuation was codenamed Operation Dynamo and commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. At 1900 hours on May the 26th, Ramsay was ordered to commence Operation Dynamo. He had been counting on 3 French ports being available for the evacuation, but by now, both Boulogne and Calais had been captured. With Dunkirk the only port remaining in Allied hands, Ramsay feared no more than 45,000 troops could be rescued. On the evening of May the 25th, Lord John Gort had ordered the British Expeditionary Force to retreat to the sea. His decision was prompted by the critical position of the Belgian army on the Allied left. It had already used up all its reserves and was on the brink of collapse. Once the Germans overran the Belgian line, they could then strike at the British army's exposed flank. Gort felt it was wiser to retreat than comply with Weygand's orders for an attack to the south. The following day, the Germans finally broke through the Belgian defenses. Just as importantly, Hitler gave permission for Army Group A to resume its advance. On May the 27th, the exhausted Belgian army could fight no further, and King Leopold asked the Germans for an armistice. By dragging out the surrender negotiations, the Belgians managed to buy their allies an extra 24 hours in the life-or-death race for Dunkirk. Nonetheless, it took hard and desperate fighting by French and British forces to keep their escape routes open. One British division was reduced to the size of a single brigade by nightfall on the 27th. The following day, the Belgians officially surrendered. At Lille, almost half of the French First Army, who had been slow to retreat, were cut off. Despite being surrounded, they chose to fight on, and over the next 3 days would tie down 7 German divisions. That evening, the retreating Allies were hemmed into a narrow bridgehead around Dunkirk, and only 25,000 men had yet been evacuated. But the vast armada of small boats now began to arrive, enabling more and more troops to be rescued each day. Poor weather had hindered Luftwaffe operations during the early stages of the evacuation. The first heavy Luftwaffe raid did not come until May the 29th, but their attacks increased in intensity over the next 3 days. Though the RAF committed every available plane to provide fighter cover, they were heavily outnumbered. Nor could they stay long because of the distance from England. Luftwaffe attacks accounted for 243 ships, including 8 destroyers and 8 troop carriers. Luckily for the British Expeditionary Force, the Luftwaffe failed to put Dunkirk harbour out of action. It was from the harbour, rather than the beaches, that the great majority of troops were embarked. On May the 31st, the Allies were forced to fall back to the line of defences along the Franco-Belgian frontier. German pressure on the perimeter continued throughout the next day, and there were further massive assaults from the Luftwaffe. Yet again, the Allied rearguard was forced back, though they managed to prevent a German breakthrough. On June the 2nd, daylight evacuation had to be suspended because of the ferocity of Luftwaffe attacks. But by then, Operation Dynamo was nearly finished. That night, the last British troops were brought safely away. On June the 3rd, the Germans drove the French rearguard, numbering 30,000, into the outskirts of Dunkirk itself. That bitterness amongst the French, many of whom accused their chief ally of abandoning them. Nonetheless, Operation Dynamo had been an astounding success. A total of 338,000 Allied troops had been brought safely to England. Even though Britain had suffered a catastrophic defeat, Dunkirk took on an immediate mythic resonance for the British people. It symbolized their brave and resourceful resistance to German might. To that extent, Dunkirk had a profound inspirational effect, which helped Britain to continue fighting, even when, as now, her position seemed hopeless. For while Britain had succeeded in rescuing her army from the brink of destruction, that army was currently in no condition to fight another campaign. Nearly all its heavy weaponry, transport and material had been abandoned, including 2,500 guns, 64,000 vehicles, and well over 500,000 tons of stores and equipment. With the cream of the Allied armies routed in Belgium, it could only be a matter of time before Germany finished off Weygand's remaining forces. In less than 4 weeks of fighting, the French had already lost 30 divisions and most of their armor. Their allies had also been defeated. As for the Germans, most of their infantry had scarcely been engaged yet, and the panzer divisions were now rested and refitted. They had already established large and solid bridgeheads at both Amiens and Peronne. All that faced them was another hastily constructed French line. Weygand's forces were deployed along the line of the Somme and Aisne rivers, 49 French divisions manned this front's 225 miles, with 17 more left in the Maginot Line. There were also 4 British divisions. 2 of these had been isolated from Gort's main force and thus missed the Dunkirk evacuation, while the other 2 were newly arrived from England. The French forces included 6 much depleted mechanized and armored divisions, and the British also had 1 weakened armored division. The French were opposed by 130 German infantry divisions, including the fresh 2nd and 9th armies. The panzers were regrouped into 5 armored corps, each containing 2 panzer divisions and 1 of motorized infantry. 3 of these corps were given to Army Group B in the west, one being commanded by Rommel and the other 2 by Kleist. The 2 remaining panzer corps, under Guderian, went to Army Group A in the east. To bolster his weak forces, Weygand ordered the construction of a checkerboard of closed operational bases called hedgehogs. These were installed in woods and villages and packed with artillery used in an anti-tank role. Even if outflanked, the hedgehogs were designed to be able to continue resisting. The German offensive opened in the west on June the 5th. The French put up a determined resistance, and the Germans had difficulty in subduing the hedgehogs. At last, on the 7th, Rommel's panzers broke through towards Rouen. French resistance in this sector promptly collapsed. Rommel had dealt with the hedgehogs by bypassing them completely and leaving them for the infantry to mop up. Army Group A's offensive began on June the 9th and also ran into stiff resistance. But that night, Guderian got his tanks across the Aisne. The next day, he widened his bridgehead, and with the remaining panzer divisions following through, the French defense gave way. Weygand's armies began to disintegrate on all fronts, and on June the 10th, Reynaud and his government left Paris. 4 days later, the Germans entered the city. On June the 16th, Reynaud resigned and a new cabinet was formed, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain. 84 years old, Pétain had been one of the heroes of France's victory in World War I. In the present crisis, however, Pétain could see no point in prolonging the struggle. A request for an armistice was transmitted to Hitler. The following day, June the 17th, Pétain made a national broadcast instructing the French to stop fighting. By June the 19th, Rommel occupied Cherbourg, which marked the end of his campaign. In 6 weeks, his 7th Panzer, nicknamed the Phantom Division for its apparent ability to appear out of nowhere, had captured nearly 100,000 prisoners, as well as hundreds of guns and armored vehicles. His own casualties came to just over 2,500, of which fewer than 700 were killed. Only 42 of his tanks had been destroyed. In the east, Guderian's remorseless panzer drive quickly cut off all the French troops in the Maginot Line before pushing on to the Swiss border. To his right, Kleist's Panzer Corps crossed the Loire and penetrated as far as Lyon. On June the 20th, Hitler delivered his terms to the French envoys. Hitler's main objective was to cut France off from Britain. The northern part of France would be occupied by Germany and used as a base for continuing the war with Britain. The remainder would be governed from Vichy by a regime headed by Pétain. The French could keep their fleet and their colonies. Hitler had a humiliating surprise in store for the French. He had located the railway carriage in which the German commanders surrendered to the French at the end of the Great War. German engineers were ordered to hack down the walls of the museum in which the carriage was housed and bring it to the exact place it had stood on that famous occasion. There, in the forest of Rotonde, 50 miles northeast of Paris, Hitler awaited the French delegation on June the 21st. When the French, led by General Hunziker, arrived and recognized the carriage, they were aghast. It was Hitler's supreme gesture of revenge. One German diarist later wrote, "The Battle of France is over. It has lasted 26 years." On June the 22nd, General Weygand authorized the acceptance of German terms, and the three French armies, cut off in the east, a total of 400,000 men, surrendered. At 12:35 a.m. on June the 25th, the fighting officially ceased. Though Germany had not asked for the handing over of the French fleet, Britain still feared its ships falling into German hands. On the 3rd of July, the Royal Navy attacked the main French squadrons, putting many ships out of action. This raid caused great bitterness and badly soured Anglo-French relations. The German conquest of the West had cost them just over 150,000 casualties, of whom only 27,000 were killed. Total Allied losses in killed and wounded came to 390,000, while 2 million more were taken prisoner. The Luftwaffe lost 1,284 planes and the RAF 931, more than half of which were precious fighters. The French Air Force had some 560 planes destroyed. The Germans also captured huge amounts of Allied equipment of all kinds. Germany's crushing victory confirmed its position as the supreme power in Western Europe. Their only remaining enemy, Britain, was isolated and much weakened. Hitler was convinced she would soon throw in the towel. Even before the armistice came into effect, he had ordered the demobilization of 35 divisions, and the panzer groups were to be broken up. As far as Hitler was concerned, the war in the West was effectively over. Buoyed by his great triumph, Hitler was already starting to contemplate a campaign against the Soviet Union. Yet by letting the British Expeditionary Force slip through his fingers at Dunkirk, Hitler ensured that Britain could continue fighting. He was therefore about to lead Germany into a war on two fronts. His most spectacular victory thus sowed the seeds of his ultimate defeat.